Hey everyone, it's Mark from Flight Sim School. We are wrapping up our look at pre-flight and ground operations in the 777 today. In the previous episode, we learned all about setting up the CDU, and today we're going to button down the last little bit of preparation that we need. We'll get the engine started, and we'll look at how to taxi, because it is a big airplane and it takes a little bit of getting used to. We're picking up right where we left off in the previous video with the CDU all prepared, and our next step is going to be to bring up the integrated checklist on the multifunction display, and that's loaded up with Boeing's recommended checklist for the plane, which won't give you a step-by-step of how to fly the plane, just to be clear, but it does still come in useful to make sure that you haven't forgotten anything important. You can access both the normal and the non-normal checklists from here, so if something breaks at any point, it's not a bad idea to come into the non-normal menu just to see if there's a related checklist for the issue in question, because it could give you some pretty good hints as to how to deal with it. For now though, we'll go back to the normal menu and we'll start from the pre-flight checks to make sure that we didn't miss anything. We'll skip the oxygen mask check for today just because we're focusing on what we need to fly the plane only. Right after that though, we have a check for the altimeter and the heading indicator. We're meant to check that all of the instruments are pointing at the same heading, both on the captain's side, the first officer's side, and the backup instruments, but in a simulator it's unlikely that this could go wrong, so I actually take the occasion to also set the heading bug to the runway heading while I'm at it. So if we pull out our airport diagram, we're taking off on runway 25 and it's on a heading of 251 degrees, so that's what we're going to have to set here. For the altimeter, we'll need to set it to the local setting, which for the most part, I just cheat a little bit here and press the B key to avoid having to look it up and set it. But if you prefer, you can get the local baro from the EFB if you go under the departure weather, or from Navigraph, or anywhere else really, and then you can set it up by hand by turning the dial right here. Back on the checklist, we can mark the flight instruments as set. And next we need to set the parking brake, but if we actually have a look at it, it's already been pulled up, so it should be marked as set already. One way to fix this is to depress the brake pedals, which will release the parking brake, and if you keep the brakes depressed and you pull on the lever again, it should auto-complete the item. Or the other option is to just use the item override button that's at the bottom of the display to force it to complete. The fuel control switches are already set to the off position, but they're on the overhead in case you're wondering. They're all off right now just like we want, and you can always tell fairly easily because they'll indicate that they're on once they're enabled. That does it for the pre-flight checklist, so we can mark that as normal, and that'll then automatically bring us to the before start checklist. The switch for the flight deck doors is at the bottom left of the pedestal, but it's not actually modeled yet, so we can skip over that and just mark it as done. And the passenger signs can go to the on position on the overhead just to make sure that they stay on until we're safely in the air. Next, we need to set a few things on the MCP based on the performance data that we calculated in the CDU from the last video. So if we go back to the init-ref page, the V2 speed that the plane calculated for us was 155. So what we'll actually want to do is set that in the speed window so that if we were to lose an engine on takeoff, the auto throttle would maintain our V2 speed, which is going to be our single engine climb speed. After that is our heading, which we've already set to the runway heading, so we're good there. And we also need to set our first level off altitude, which if we bring up our departure procedure, we can see that we need to cross dark at a max altitude of 12,000 feet. So that's what we're going to set in the altitude window. That's going to cover it for the MCP. Our takeoff speeds have already been calculated, so we can tick that off. And our CDU is already all set as well. So the next step is going to be to set up the trim. Back on the init-ref page, when we input the center of gravity, it automatically calculated the trim units for us, which is going to be 5 in this case. But to be able to set it, what we actually have to start by doing is turning on all of our hydraulics so that the stabilizer trim can actually move. You're going to want to start from the right-hand switch and put it into the auto position. Once it's no longer faulted, it'll just take a second or so. We can turn all of the other switches to the auto position as well. And then we can turn the C1 and the C2 system on too. With all of those enabled, we can head back down to the trim indicator, which is pointing at 4 right now, but as we saw on the init ref page, we need to get it to 5. So we'll need to add some nose up trim to get it there so that when we go to rotate on takeoff, we don't struggle too much to get it off the ground. The buttons on the left of the yoke are there to adjust the trim position, and assuming you have them bound to keys on your controller, you can just hold the nose up trim until it moves it down to 5 like we want. If we head back to our checklist now, the trim is set. We'll do our takeoff briefing just a little bit later. And the last thing here is the beacon that needs to be turned on the overhead, which will auto-complete the before start checklist for us. I do have one more item that I always check at this point though. This plane remembers its state from flight to flight, so any wear and tear that you accumulate is gonna follow you around. So the last thing that I like to do here is to just double check the health of all the plane's systems before it's too late. If we head over to the stat page of the multifunction display, the top line here is showing us the hydraulic fluid quantity on board, and right now it's near full up at 1.0. If it were low, it'd be showing just a little bit differently with the letters RF next to it to indicate that it needs to be refilled, and at that point you'd want to actually head over to the tablet and then into the ground ops app to fix it. Over on the ground maintenance tab, which is all the way at the end on the bottom right here, we can refill the hydraulics, but on top of that, while you're here, it's not a bad idea to inspect all of the other parts of the plane and fix anything that looks like it requires attention, either in yellow or red. With that done though, we're pretty much ready to push from the gate. So we'll head over to the ground connections to release any of the ground power, the jetway, or the AC unit if they're still connected. And lastly, we'll also remove the wheel chocks. We'll do effectively the exact same thing on the ground services tab by just releasing all of the vehicles. And then if we head over to the doors page, we'll close them all up as well with the close all button. That'll take a couple of seconds to run. And then once that's completed, finally what we can do is arm all the doors so that we're ready to go. For the pushback itself, as of the time I'm recording this, there is no built-in way to push back like there is on the 737, so you have a couple of different options here. First of all, there's the built-in pushback that comes with Flight Sim, which you can access through the ATC menu under Ground Services, and then checking under any of those frequencies, you'll have the option to choose to push back. The main problem with it is that it's very hard to be precise with where it's going to put you, but it does get the job done, even if not very well. Another option on PC is to download the free version of the pushback toolbar from flightsim.to. That's what I'm using here today. I like it a lot because you can pre-plan your pushback and then not worry about where it's going to push you, letting you focus on other stuff like starting the engines. The only setting that I recommend changing if you're going to use this is the option to raise the plane on pushback. I've had issues with it where it would just drop the plane all at once and cause it to tail strike, which really isn't the best thing when you're gearing up for a long flight. The other free add-on for pushbacks that I've also started using recently is Pushback Helper, which works great not only for the 777 but for any other plane as well, so really the choice is going to be up to you. The other payware option is to buy into GSX, but personally I don't find it worth it for what it gives me. So at this point I'd stick with the pushback toolbar or pushback helper, and once PMDG update the plane with a new pushback experience, then you can use that. The engines can also be started as you're pushing back, but just for simplicity purposes I waited till it was completed, so we'll have to head back onto the overhead to do that. The first thing we have to do, which I seem to forget about a lot for some reason, is to turn the fuel pumps on. The 777 has forward and aft pumps on the left side and on the right side, so in both wings, but on top of that there's also center tanks for those really long haul flights. For our flight today, there's no fuel in the center tank, so we don't need to turn them on. If you're unsure about it, what you can do is just turn the pump on. If there's no fuel in it, you'll get an orange low pressure message appear just like we do here, and you can just turn it back to off. The other way that you can check your fuel in the center tanks, which is probably the correct way to do it, is to bring up the fuel page on the multifunction display. And from here, you'll be able to see how much fuel is in each tank. And we can see that there's literally nothing in the center tanks today. We can head back to the overhead now, and the auto start push button is already enabled on. So all that's left to do here is to put the start switch for engine number 1 to the start position. And then from there, we have to head back down just below the throttles and put the fuel control switch to the run position. At this point, the engine is going to do its auto start procedure, and we can switch to the engine display on the multifunction display to monitor the startup. Or for a little bit more fun, you can hit outside for the engine start, which is where I find you really get the best startup sounds, especially when the engine lights off. If we have a look at the engine gauges, the EGT gauge on the left, you can see the little red notch has disappeared, which means that we're pretty much ready to start the second engine. So it's going to be the exact same process as before, except we'll be using the opposite starter first and then using the opposite fuel control switch as well. While the second engine's starting up, we can go through a few final preparatory things, and we'll start by enabling both of our flight directors, first on the captain's side and then on the first officer's side, and that's going to show us the pink crosshairs in the primary flight display that's going to tell us where we need to put the nose of the plane to stay on the flight path. Next, we'll arm both LNAV and VNAV so that once we enable the autopilot, it knows what modes we want it to be in, and we'll look more into what both of those modes do in the next video, especially the VNAV, which can be a little bit tricky. The auto throttle is also armed, so once we get going down the runway and we press the toga button, the auto throttle button should turn green as well to tell us that it's controlling the throttle for us pretty much for the entirety of the flight. So while we were looking at all of that, our second engine finished starting up and everything is looking normal on our multifunction display here. So now we just have to go through the checklist and finish up the before taxi stuff and we can be on our way. The first item is the anti-ice, and that's all on the overhead. First off, we've got our window heat, which is already on, and both the wing and the engine anti-ice are already in the auto position, which will be fine for today. But if you're clearly flying into visible moisture, you might want to consider putting the engine anti-ice to the on position just to make sure that it stays on until you clear all of that moisture. Back on the checklist now, we can check the anti-ice off, and the next item is to check the recall for any messages that we may have missed on the ICAS. That's just right over on the right with the other MFD pages, and there's nothing there for now, so we're good to go for that item as well. The auto brakes need to be set to the rejected takeoff position, and what that'll do for us is if we end up bringing the throttles back to idle during our takeoff roll, it'll automatically apply maximum braking power to get us to stop before we run out of runway. I usually use the flight controls check as my opportunity to make sure that I've set my bindings correctly because I'm often swapping planes and switching what settings I'm using. We'll skip that for today though. And the last thing is to make sure that there's nothing around us that could get in our way. And with that done, we're pretty much ready to go. Getting this plane moving when it's lightly loaded like today is not very hard. First off, we've got to release the parking brakes just by depressing the brakes for about a second or so and then releasing them, and we'll see the parking brake handle go down. And then from there, all you'll need to do is apply a little bit of throttle to get moving, and at that point you can just bring the thrust back to idle and it'll keep moving for you. You're gonna accelerate slowly this way, but you can see your ground speed in the bottom left of the PFD, and for really long straightaways you can let the speed build up to about 20 to 25 knots, but any more than that just starts to be a little bit too fast. The tricky part about taxiing the 777 is that it's just incredibly long, and those rear landing gear take up a fair amount of width as well. So if you combine that with smallish taxiways, even at big airports like LAX here, it can make for some really tough turns, but there are a couple of things that you can keep in mind that'll help you out. First of all, in order to stay on the center line, you can use the vertical line of the flight director in the PFD as your reference point. Otherwise, you can also use the notch in the wiper as well, which actually might be a little bit easier. anywhere in that general area is going to keep you right down the middle of the taxiway. Taking corners is where it becomes a bit more tricky. First off, you're going to want to slow down to about 8 knots or so using only the brakes and no reversers. And this will seem bizarre at first, but what you actually want to do is go past the center of the taxiway that you're turning onto. Once the center line is just about aligned with the end of the second window is when you can start your turn, and that should keep your rear wheels near the center of the taxiway and also have enough clearance to keep the nose gear out of the dirt, because you have to remember that the nose gear is actually just a little bit behind where you're sitting. One feature that the real 777 has that we don't have in Flight Sim are taxi cameras, and they come in really useful if you want to stay in the cockpit, but if you need to, you can always fall back to the external view to make sure that you stay on the taxiway. In the next video, we're finally going to get airborne and learn all of the most important things that you should know about flying this plane, but in the meantime, make sure that you've liked the video and subscribe as well so you don't miss out on the next one.